My son kept coming home from his grandmother's house with bruises he wouldn't explain, but she insisted he was just clumsy. My 6-year-old son Oliver started coming home with bruises every Thursday after spending the day at my mother's house. First it was his forearms, small purple ovals I convinced myself came from playground falls. Then I found 3 parallel welts across his lower back, spaced exactly like fingers. When I asked what happened, he'd go still, eyes fixed on the floor, and whisper, "I don't remember, Mommy." My mother had watched him every Thursday for 2 years since my husband left. She insisted grandmothers were meant to raise grandchildren. Never asked for money. Always had him fed and bathed when I arrived. The perfect arrangement, until 3 months ago. The bruises followed a pattern I didn't want to see. Always his back, upper arms, places clothing would hide. Never his face. Whoever was hurting him knew exactly what they were doing. One Thursday, I found fingerprint bruises wrapped around his bicep, 4 distinct marks and a thumb impression on the inside. I asked if someone grabbed him hard. "Grandma says I bruise easy," he said. Like a banana. My stomach dropped. "Grandma said that?" He nodded, then his face crumpled with panic. "Don't tell her I told you." "Please, Mommy. She said if I told, you'd lose your job and we'd live in a box under the bridge." That night I photographed every mark on his body. 17 bruises in various stages of healing. Yellow ones fading, purple ones fresh. A constellation of evidence I'd been too desperate to see. I called his pediatrician the next morning. Dr. Reyes examined him while I waited outside. When she emerged, her face was professionally neutral, but I caught the tightness around her eyes. "The bruising pattern is consistent with non-accidental injury," she said carefully. "Grab marks. Impact marks with uniform edges, likely from a flat object. Some are deep tissue bruises that would require significant force." "How much force?" "Enough to cause him pain for days." That's when the memories started surfacing. Images I'd buried for 30 years. My mother's hand across my face when I spilled milk. The wooden spoon she kept in the kitchen drawer. How I'd learned to make myself small and silent and invisible. How I'd told myself it was normal, that every mother disciplined like that I deserved it for being difficult. I'd handed my son to my abuser every Thursday for 2 years. I installed a recording app on Oliver's tablet that night. Told him it was a new educational game. The next Thursday, I sent him with the tablet and picked him up at 6 like normal. New bruise on his shoulder blade. My mother offered me coffee and complained about her hip pain. Oliver hugged her goodbye, but I noticed how he turned his body, keeping his injured shoulder away from her grip. That night, I listened with headphones while Oliver slept. The first 2 hours were mundane. Television, lunch, Oliver playing quietly, too quietly for a 6-year-old. Then he asked for a second juice box. "You already had one." My mother's voice turned to ice. Greedy children get corrected. "I'm really thirsty, Grandma." The sound of a slap. Oliver crying. "You want to cry? I'll give you something to cry about. Your mother works herself to death so you can have nice things, and this is how you repay her? Being greedy and selfish?" Another hit. Harder. Oliver's crying turned to gasping. "Your mother can't afford daycare. You want her to lose everything because you can't behave? You want to sleep in a shelter?" "No, Grandma." "Then stop. Crying. Now." The recording captured 4 more incidents. Hitting him for laughing too loud during her show. For asking to call me. For accidentally stepping on her foot. Each time she reminded him that telling would destroy me. Would make us homeless. Would prove he didn't love his mother. She'd turned my son into her silent victim. The same way she'd turned me into one 30 years ago. I drove to her house at midnight. She smiled when she opened the door, still in her robe. "Is Oliver okay?" I played the recording. Her expression cycled through confusion, anger, and finally cold defiance. "You recorded me in my own home? That's illegal. You beat my son. I discipline him, the way I disciplined you, and you turned out fine." I turned out terrified. I turned out with memories I had to bury just to function. I turned out handing my child to someone who hurt me because I convinced myself it never happened. She laughed. "You'll be back Thursday. You need me. I will never let you touch him again. Then you'll lose your job. You'll lose your apartment. And when you're begging for help, I'll remind you of this moment." I left without another word. But the next morning at 7 a.m., someone was pounding on my door. 2 police officers and a CPS worker. My mother stood behind them, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I'm so worried about my grandson," she was saying. "His mother has been struggling with stress. I've noticed bruises on him for months. I didn't want to believe it, but a grandmother has to protect her grandchild. She looked directly at me and smiled. I forced my shoulders down and kept my voice level even though every muscle wanted to shake. The older officer explained that my mother filed a report this morning claiming she witnessed me hitting Oliver multiple times over the past few months. She told them I was under stress from being a single parent and losing control. The younger officer shifted his weight and glanced at Oliver, who stood frozen against the wall with his backpack still on. A woman in a gray blazer stepped forward and introduced herself as Kara Thornton from Child Protective Services. She had kind eyes, but a professional distance that made my stomach clench. She asked if she could talk to Oliver alone in his bedroom while the officers spoke with me. My mother dabbed at her eyes with that tissue again, playing the concerned grandmother perfectly. I nodded and watched Oliver walk down the hall with Kara, his steps small and careful like he was trying not to make any sound. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the photo folder I'd created last night. 17 pictures of bruises on my son's body, each one dated and showing different stages of healing. I handed the phone to Kara before she closed Oliver's bedroom door. She took it and her professional mask slipped for just a second as she scrolled through the first few images. Her jaw tightened and she looked at me with something that might have been understanding before following Oliver into his room. The door clicked shut. One officer asked me to sit down at the kitchen table while the other one talked quietly with my mother in the living room. I could hear her voice carrying, explaining how worried she'd been, how she didn't want to believe her own daughter could hurt a child, but she had to do what was right. The officer sitting across from me asked when the bruising started. I told him about the pattern I'd noticed over 3 months, always on Thursdays after Oliver spent the day at my mother's house, always in places clothing would hide. I explained about the recording I made on Oliver's tablet and offered to play it right now. The officer radioed for Detective Melton from the Child Abuse Unit. My mother's voice got louder in the living room when she heard that. She insisted this was just a misunderstanding, that she'd done her duty and needed to get home now. The officer told her everyone needed to stay until the detective arrived and finished his investigation. She sat down hard on my couch and crossed her arms. I played the recording through my phone's speaker at the kitchen table. The first slap made the officer's expression change completely. My mother's voice came through clearly, cold and sharp, telling Oliver that greedy children get corrected. The sound of Oliver crying, her threats about homelessness and losing everything. The officer listened to all 4 incidents without saying anything, but I watched his hand grip his pen tighter with each one. Detective Melton arrived faster than I expected, maybe 15 minutes after the call. He was tall with gray at his temples and moved with the kind of calm that comes from seeing terrible things regularly. He listened to the entire recording with headphones while standing in my kitchen, his eyes fixed on my mother the whole time. She stared back at him with her chin up, but I saw the moment her confidence started cracking. Her hands twisted that tissue into shreds. When the recording ended, he asked her directly if that was her voice. She said technology could fake anything these days, that I must have manipulated the audio somehow because she never said those things. He asked why Oliver would have bruises that matched the timeline of being at her house every Thursday. She claimed I must have done it myself and blamed her to avoid getting in trouble. Kara came out of Oliver's room holding my phone with the photos still on the screen. She asked if she could examine Oliver physically to document current injuries. Oliver appeared in the hallway behind her, his eyes huge and scared. He looked at me like he was asking permission to exist. I smiled at him and nodded even though my throat felt tight enough to choke me. This was exactly what my mother had done to him, making him afraid of adults looking at his body, teaching him that examination meant punishment was coming. Kara took him into the bathroom and closed the door partway. I heard her gentle voice explaining what she was doing and asking if anything hurt. My mother stood up and announced she'd done her civic duty and needed to leave now. Detective Melton moved to block the doorway without seeming aggressive about it. He said everyone involved needed to stay until he finished investigating both claims. She demanded to know if she was under arrest. He said not yet, but she could make that decision easier if she tried to leave. Kara's voice came from the bathroom asking Oliver how he got the bruise on his shoulder. I heard him start to say he didn't remember, then stop. A long silence. Then his small voice, barely loud enough to hear, saying Grandma grabbed him hard yesterday when he asked for juice. My mother's face went white and then red. She started to say something, but Detective Melton held up his hand. Kara emerged with Oliver and told the detective she'd found fresh bruising consistent with an adult grip on the child's shoulder blade. The injury was less than 24 hours old based on the color and swelling. She showed Detective Melton photos she'd taken on her own phone. He asked Oliver directly if his grandma hurt him. Oliver looked at my mother and then at the floor. He whispered yes. Detective Melton asked to speak with my mother privately in my bedroom. She followed him with her back straight and her mouth set in a hard line. Another officer stayed with me in the living room. I could hear her voice rising through the closed door, insisting I was manipulating everyone, that she was the real victim here, that I'd turned her grandson against her with lies. She said she only ever disciplined him the way any good grandmother would, the way she'd raised me, and I turned out fine. The officer standing near me shifted uncomfortably. Oliver came over and climbed into my lap without asking. His whole body trembled against mine. I wrapped my arms around him and felt wetness on my shirt where his face pressed against my shoulder. He kept whispering he was sorry. Sorry for telling. Sorry for getting Grandma in trouble. Sorry for making everything bad. I held him tighter and told him he did nothing wrong. Telling the truth is always right. Nobody should ever hurt him. We're going to be okay. Kara made several phone calls from my kitchen, speaking in low professional tones. She reviewed the photos again and listened to portions of the recording with her supervisor on speaker. When she came back to the living room, she explained she was bringing in her supervisor because this case involved documented abuse by the person who filed the false report. The situation was more complex than standard protocol covered. My mother emerged from the bedroom with Detective Melton behind her. Her face was blotchy and her hands shook, but she still tried to maintain that victim expression. She pointed at me and said I'd poisoned Oliver against her, that I was making him lie because I wanted to hurt her. Detective Melton asked her to explain the recording of her voice threatening a 6-year-old child. She said I must have edited it somehow, that she never hit him hard enough to leave marks, that discipline wasn't abuse. He asked if she was admitting to hitting Oliver. She stopped talking and pressed her lips together. He told her she could come to the station voluntarily for formal questioning, or he could arrest her right now for suspected child abuse and filing a false police report. She chose not to speak. The detective pulled out his phone and showed her the recording app on Oliver's tablet. He explained that the recording was legal under state law, because parents have the right to monitor their minor children's safety. She started to protest, but he held up his hand and told her she could explain everything at the station, or she could be arrested right now. Her face went from red to pale in seconds. A woman in a gray suit walked through my apartment door without knocking. She introduced herself as Bernadette Thornton and said she was Kara's supervisor at CPS. She looked at Oliver sitting in my lap, and then at my mother standing near the bedroom door. She asked Kara to show her the photographs from the examination. They stepped into the kitchen and spoke in low voices while looking at Kara's phone. Bernadette came back and announced that Oliver needed to go to the hospital immediately for a complete forensic examination. She explained they would photograph every injury with medical equipment and document everything with professional precision. This would create an official record that could be used in court. My mother stepped forward and said she was coming to the hospital. She insisted she had grandparents' rights and needed to be there for Oliver's examination. Bernadette's expression didn't change, but her voice got colder. She informed my mother that she was now the subject of a child abuse investigation and would not be allowed any contact with Oliver until the investigation concluded. My mother started to argue, but Bernadette cut her off and said the protective order was already being processed. Detective Melton told my mother she needed to come to the police station for formal questioning about the abuse allegations and the false report she filed. She refused and said she wasn't going anywhere without her lawyer. He nodded slowly and said that was her right, but if she didn't come voluntarily, he would arrest her right now for suspected child abuse and making a false statement to police. She looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes. She grabbed her purse from my couch and walked toward the door. The detective followed her out and I heard him radio for a patrol car to transport her to the station. Kara touched my shoulder gently and said we should take Oliver to the hospital now. I stood up with Oliver still clinging to me and followed her out to her car. The morning sun felt too bright after everything that happened in my dim apartment. I buckled Oliver into the back seat and climbed in next to him. Kara started driving and Oliver asked in a small voice if Grandma was going to jail. I took his hand and told him honestly that I didn't know yet, but that she wouldn't be able to hurt him anymore. He nodded and pressed his face against my arm. I watched my mother get into the back of a police car through Kara's rear window. She didn't look back at us. The hospital emergency room was crowded, but Kara walked straight to the registration desk and showed her CPS identification. A nurse appeared within minutes and led us down a hallway to a private examination room. The forensic examiner arrived 15 minutes later. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and she knelt down to Oliver's level. She introduced herself and explained that she needed to take some pictures of his bruises to help keep him safe. She promised it wouldn't hurt and that he could hold my hand the whole time. Oliver looked at me and I nodded. She had him change into a hospital gown and then began photographing each bruise with a professional camera. She measured every mark with a ruler and spoke into a recording device describing the location, size, and color of each injury. The fresh bruise on his shoulder blade was deep purple with clear finger impressions. She spent extra time documenting that one from multiple angles. Dr. Reyes walked into the examination room carrying a thick file folder. She smiled at Oliver and then handed the folder to Kara. She explained that she'd documented the bruising patterns at Oliver's appointment 2 weeks ago, with detailed notes and photographs. She told Kara this was the clearest case of non-accidental injury she'd seen in 15 years of pediatric practice. The pattern was too consistent, and the injuries were in locations that don't get hurt during normal childhood activities. Kara thanked her and added the medical file to her growing stack of documentation. After the physical examination finished, Kara asked if she could interview Oliver privately. I hesitated, but she assured me the interview would be recorded, and I could watch from an observation room if I wanted. I kissed Oliver's forehead and told him to tell the truth about everything. The nurse led me to a small room with a window looking into the examination room. Kara sat down with Oliver and pulled out 2 anatomical dolls. She asked him gentle questions about what happened at Grandma's house using language a 6-year-old could understand. Oliver pointed to the doll's arm and said, "Grandma grabbed him there when he asked for juice." He showed how she hit his back with her hand when he laughed during her show. He demonstrated with the doll how she used a wooden spoon on his legs when he accidentally stepped on her foot. Then he mentioned the hairbrush. Kara asked about the hairbrush, and Oliver said Grandma hit him with it once because his laughing was too loud, and she couldn't hear the TV. He touched the doll's back to show where. I pressed my hand against the window glass and watched my little boy describe his abuse with heartbreaking clarity. The examination took 3 hours total. Oliver fell asleep against my shoulder in the waiting room while Kara finished her paperwork. His body was heavy with exhaustion, and his face looked peaceful for the first time all day. Kara came over and sat down next to me. She said I could take him home now, but someone from CPS would visit tomorrow to check our living situation and make sure we had everything we needed. She handed me her card and told me to call any time if I had questions or concerns. I thanked her and carefully stood up with Oliver in my arms. He didn't wake up even when I buckled him into my car. I drove home slowly, checking on him in the rearview mirror every few seconds. The afternoon sun was starting to set, and I realized we'd been at the hospital since morning. My phone had 17 missed calls from my mother's number. I blocked it before I even got out of the car. I carried Oliver inside, and he stayed asleep the whole way up to our apartment. His body felt heavier than usual, like all the stress had worn him out completely. I laid him on his bed without even taking off his shoes because I didn't want to wake him. The apartment felt quiet in a way it hadn't in months, like something had shifted. I sat on the edge of his bed watching him breathe, his face relaxed and peaceful. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Work. I'd completely forgotten about calling in. I stepped into the hallway and pulled up my supervisor's number. Carly answered on the second ring, and I explained that I had a family emergency and wouldn't be in today. She cut me off before I could finish apologizing and told me not to worry about work right now. She asked if everything was okay, and if there was anything she could do to help. I thanked her and said I'd explain more when I came back. She told me to take care of my son first, and that my job would be waiting whenever I was ready. I hung up feeling grateful that at least one thing in my life wasn't falling apart. Oliver woke up around dinner time. I made him mac and cheese from a box because it was his favorite, and I wanted him to feel safe. He sat at our small kitchen table pushing the noodles around with his fork. Finally, he looked up at me with those big worried eyes. He asked if he had to go back to Grandma's house on Thursday. My chest tightened. I got down on my knees next to his chair so we were eye level. I promised him he would never have to go there again. I told him I would find another way to take care of him on my work days. He asked how because I couldn't afford daycare. I said I didn't know yet, but I would figure it out because keeping him safe was the most important thing. He nodded and went back to eating his mac and cheese. He finished the whole bowl, which was more than he'd eaten in weeks. That night, I tucked him into bed and read him 2 stories. He fell asleep halfway through the second one. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mother standing behind those police officers with her fake tears and her smile. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. Oliver's scream woke me at 2 a.m. I ran into his room and found him sitting up in bed crying. He asked if Grandma knew where we lived. I turned on his nightlight and sat on the bed with him. I told him yes, she knew where we lived, but she wasn't allowed to come here. He asked if she could get in. I promised him I would keep the door locked and she couldn't get in without my permission. He cried harder and said Grandma told him she could take him away anytime she wanted. I held him close and explained that Grandma lied to scare him, but it wasn't true. He fell back asleep in my arms. The same thing happened again at 4 a.m. and then again at 5:30. Each time he woke up terrified, asking the same questions about whether Grandma could find him or take him away. By 6 a.m, we were both exhausted, and I gave up on sleep. I made pancakes for breakfast and let Oliver watch cartoons even though it was a school day. He needed normal and safe more than he needed 2nd grade. Someone knocked on the door around 9. I looked through the peephole and saw Kara standing there with another woman in business clothes. I let them in, and Kara introduced the other woman as another CPS worker who was there to inspect our living situation. They walked through the apartment checking everything. They looked at Oliver's bed and his toys. They opened the fridge and cabinets to see what food we had. They asked about our daily routine and how I normally supervised Oliver. The other woman wrote notes on a clipboard while Kara asked questions. Oliver sat on the couch watching them nervously. After about 30 minutes, they finished their inspection. Kara told the other woman she could wait in the car. Once we were alone, Kara sat down on the couch next to me. She explained that based on all the evidence they'd collected, CPS was filing for emergency protective custody. This would legally prevent my mother from having any contact with Oliver. She said the forensic evidence from the hospital, plus the recording, plus the medical documentation from Dr. Reyes, made this one of the strongest cases she'd ever handled. She handed me papers to sign giving permission for the protective order. I signed them immediately. Kara promised me that my mother wouldn't be able to get near Oliver while this was processed. She stood up to leave and reminded me to call if I needed anything. Oliver ran over and hugged my leg as soon as the door closed behind her. My phone rang that afternoon. Detective Melton. He told me my mother had been questioned for 4 hours yesterday at the police station. She eventually admitted to hitting Oliver but claimed it was normal discipline. The way she was raised, the way she raised me. He said they were charging her with child abuse and also with filing a false police report. The charges would be formally filed within the next few days. He asked if I was doing okay, and I said yes, even though I wasn't sure. He told me to expect my mother's lawyer to reach out and warned me not to talk to them without my own lawyer present. I thanked him and hung up. I sat on the couch staring at my phone. Part of me still couldn't believe my own mother would hurt Oliver the same way she hurt me. I'd spent 30 years convincing myself it wasn't that bad, that I'd exaggerated it in my memory, that she'd done her best. But the recording didn't lie. The bruises didn't lie. Oliver's fear didn't lie. I started crying and couldn't stop. All those years of telling myself I was fine, that I'd turned out okay, that it was just how things were back then. I'd been lying to myself while handing my son to his abuser every single Thursday. Kara called to check on me and heard me crying. She gently suggested I might benefit from therapy to process my own childhood trauma. I said I'd think about it. She reminded me that taking care of myself would help me take care of Oliver better. After we hung up, I sat there thinking maybe she was right. A text message came through from a number I didn't recognize. It said it was my mother's lawyer and asked if we could talk about dropping the charges and working this out as a family. I stared at the message, feeling anger rise up in my chest. I blocked the number immediately and then forwarded the screenshot to Detective Melton with a note explaining what happened. He texted back within minutes saying he'd document the contact, and that I'd done the right thing by not responding. The next day, Carly called from work to check on me. She asked how Oliver was doing, and I told her everything was complicated, but we were managing. She said she had a teenage daughter who babysat, and she'd be happy to have her watch Oliver on Thursdays at a reduced rate since she knew money was tight for me as a single parent. I felt tears spring to my eyes at the kindness. I asked if she was sure, and Carly insisted that her daughter Madison needed the experience and loved kids. We made plans for me to meet Madison that weekend. Saturday afternoon, I drove Oliver to Carly's house. Madison answered the door with a big smile. She was 16 with her hair in a ponytail, and she immediately crouched down to Oliver's level to introduce herself. She told him she was CPR certified and showed him her card, which made him giggle. Oliver was shy at first, hiding behind my legs. Madison suggested they could build a blanket fort in the living room while I talked to her mom. Oliver peeked out from behind me and asked if they could use all the couch cushions. Madison said absolutely, and they could make it as big as they wanted. I watched Oliver slowly come out from behind me and follow Madison into the living room. Carly poured me coffee and we talked about the schedule and payment. Through the doorway, I could see Oliver and Madison laughing as they draped blankets over chairs. For the first time in months, I felt something like hope that maybe this arrangement might actually work, and Oliver could be safe and happy on Thursdays again. The emergency protective order hearing was scheduled for 3 days later at the county courthouse. I dressed Oliver in his best clothes that morning and tried to keep my hands from shaking as I buttoned his shirt. He asked if Grandma would be there, and I told him yes, but that she couldn't come near us. We arrived early and sat on a wooden bench in the hallway outside the courtroom. My mother showed up 15 minutes later with a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. She wore a pale blue cardigan and had tissues clutched in her hand. When she saw us, she dabbed at her eyes and turned away like the sight of Oliver caused her pain. Her lawyer put his hand on her shoulder in what looked like comfort. I felt sick watching her performance. Alexis Ward met us outside the courtroom and knelt down to introduce herself to Oliver. She explained that she would be talking to the judge about keeping him safe, and that he didn't have to say anything today. Oliver nodded but pressed closer to my side. We went inside when the bailiff called our case. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with fluorescent lights and beige walls. My mother sat at a table on the left with her lawyer. We sat at a table on the right with Alexis. The judge was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She looked tired. Alexis stood and began presenting the evidence. She showed the judge the photographs I'd taken of Oliver's bruises on her laptop. 17 different injuries in various stages of healing. She explained the timeline of when each photo was taken. Then she played portions of the recording I'd made. My mother's voice filled the quiet courtroom, threatening Oliver about homelessness and hitting him for asking for juice. I watched the judge's expression change from neutral to disturbed. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Oliver buried his face against my arm. Alexis submitted the medical documentation from the hospital forensic exam. She read excerpts from the report describing grab marks and impact injuries requiring significant force. She presented a written statement from Dr. Reyes, explaining that the bruising pattern was consistent with intentional abuse rather than accidental injury. The whole presentation took less than 20 minutes. My mother's lawyer tried to interrupt twice, but the judge told him to wait his turn. When Alexis finished, the judge asked my mother's lawyer if he had anything to present. He stood and argued that the recording was obtained illegally without consent in a private home. The judge cut him off and said parents have the right to monitor their children's safety. He tried again, saying this was a misunderstanding about different generational approaches to discipline. The judge looked at him over her reading glasses and asked if he'd listened to the same recording she just heard. He sat down. The judge reviewed the evidence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes. Then she looked up and said she was granting the emergency protective order immediately. My mother was prohibited from any contact with Oliver or me for 6 months pending the criminal trial. No phone calls, no messages, no third-party contact. She couldn't come within 500 feet of our home, my workplace, or Oliver's school. My mother's lawyer stood up quickly and asked about supervised visitation. He said grandparents have rights, and that completely cutting off contact would harm Oliver. The judge said the evidence showed contact with the grandmother was what had been harming Oliver, and that his safety was the only consideration that mattered. Request denied. My mother shot to her feet so fast her chair scraped loudly across the floor. She pointed at me and shouted that I was going to regret this, that I'd come crawling back when I couldn't afford childcare, that she'd make sure everyone knew what a terrible mother I was for keeping a child from his grandmother. Her lawyer grabbed her arm, trying to get her to sit down, but she kept yelling. The judge banged her gavel 3 times and warned my mother that any violation of the protective order would result in immediate arrest. She told the bailiff to escort my mother out if she didn't control herself. My mother finally stopped yelling, but her face was red and her hands were shaking. She stared at me with pure hatred. Then she looked at Oliver and her expression changed to something that looked like sadness but felt wrong. Oliver's hand squeezed mine so tight it hurt. We watched her lawyer lead her toward the exit. She turned back once at the door and mouthed something I couldn't make out. Then she was gone. That afternoon, I took Oliver to meet Chelsea Perkins at her office in a building downtown. The waiting room had toys and children's books scattered around. Chelsea came out to greet us with a warm smile. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with curly brown hair and kind eyes. She shook Oliver's hand seriously like he was an adult and asked if he wanted to see her office. He looked at me and I nodded. They disappeared down a hallway together. I sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes reading the same magazine page over and over without absorbing any words. When they came back, Oliver was holding a small stuffed bear. Chelsea explained that Oliver could keep it and bring it to sessions. She asked if I could stay for a few minutes to talk. Oliver went back to the waiting room with the receptionist who offered him crackers and juice. Chelsea sat across from me in her office and explained that Oliver would need time to feel safe expressing his feelings about what happened. She said the first several sessions would focus on play therapy and building trust. She told me Oliver was showing signs of trauma, including being very alert to adult moods and trying hard to please everyone. She called it hypervigilance and people-pleasing behaviors. She said these were normal responses to abuse, but that with consistent therapy and a safe environment, Oliver could heal. I asked how long it would take. She said every child is different, but that we should plan on at least 6 months of weekly sessions. The following Thursday was Oliver's first day with Madison. I dropped him off at Carly's house at 7:30 in the morning before work. Madison answered the door in jeans and a sweatshirt with her hair in a ponytail. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. She crouched down to Oliver's level and asked what he wanted to do today. He was shy and didn't answer. She suggested they could make cookies or build with blocks or play outside if it wasn't too cold. He whispered that he liked cookies. She grinned and said chocolate chip cookies were her specialty. I picked him up at 6 that evening after work. Oliver ran to the door when I knocked and hugged my legs. He told me excitedly about the cookies they made and the game they played where you had to hop on one foot. Madison had let him lick the spoon. They'd watched a movie about talking animals. He talked the whole drive home without stopping. I realized he was smiling more than he had in months. The tight knot in my chest loosened just a little. 2 weeks later, I was eating lunch at my desk when security called to say someone was trying to get into the building to see me. I went down to the lobby and found my mother standing by the reception desk arguing with the security guard. She saw me and started walking toward me. The guard stepped in front of her. She shouted that she had a right to see her daughter, and that this was ridiculous. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called Detective Melton. He answered on the second ring. I told him my mother was at my workplace violating the protective order. He said he'd send officers immediately and to stay away from her. The security guard was already escorting my mother toward the exit. She kept turning back to yell at me. She screamed about grandparents' rights and how I was poisoning Oliver against her. She said I'd be sorry when I needed help. Other people in the lobby were staring. My face burned with embarrassment, but I stayed where I was until she was outside. 2 police cars pulled up within 10 minutes. Detective Melton called me an hour later to say my mother had been arrested for violating the protective order. She'd spend the night in jail and see a judge in the morning for a bail hearing. He said this violation would strengthen the case against her, and that I'd done the right thing by calling immediately. I went back to my desk but couldn't focus on work for the rest of the day. My mother posted bail the next morning. Alexis called to tell me and mentioned that my mother's lawyer had contacted her office to complain. He'd said I was being vindictive and that this was tearing the family apart. Alexis had responded that my mother was being criminal, and that she'd torn the family apart herself when she chose to abuse her grandson. I felt a surge of gratitude for having someone on my side who understood what was really happening. Detective Melton called 3 weeks after my mother's arrest to tell me the criminal trial date was set. His voice came through the phone calm and steady while I sat at my kitchen table watching Oliver color at the other end. The trial would happen in 3 months, he said, which gave the prosecution time to prepare their case and organize all the evidence. He explained they had the recording of my mother hitting Oliver and threatening him. They had Dr. Reyes's medical documentation showing 17 bruises in different stages of healing. They had the photos I took that showed the fingerprint marks on Oliver's arm. They had Oliver's testimony from the forensic interview where he described being hit with her hand and with a wooden spoon. The prosecutor felt confident about getting a conviction with all this evidence lined up. I asked what would happen if my mother was found guilty. Melton said she could face up to 5 years in prison for child abuse, plus additional time for filing the false police report. The thought made my stomach twist because part of me still remembered being 6 years old and needing my mother to protect me instead of hurt me. But then I looked at Oliver carefully, staying inside the lines of his coloring book, and remembered that protecting him mattered more than any leftover feelings I had about my childhood. I started seeing a therapist the following week. Her office was in a building near my workplace with pale blue walls and soft chairs that didn't match. She asked me to call her Dr. Raymond, and she wore glasses that kept sliding down her nose. I told her about finding the bruises on Oliver and making the recording and confronting my mother at midnight. I told her about my mother showing up with police officers and trying to blame me for the abuse she caused. Dr. Raymond listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. Then she asked me to talk about my own childhood. The memories came flooding back in pieces I'd kept buried for 30 years. My mother slapping me across the face when I spilled milk at dinner. The wooden spoon she kept in the kitchen drawer that left welts on my legs when I talked back. How I learned to be quiet and small and invisible so she wouldn't notice me enough to get angry. How I convinced myself every mother disciplined that way, and I deserved it for being difficult. Dr. Raymond said I'd normalize the abuse to survive it, and then repeated the pattern by leaving Oliver with my mother every Thursday. She said protecting Oliver now meant breaking the cycle of abuse that my mother tried to continue through him. I cried in her office for 20 minutes while she handed me tissues and waited patiently. She said we'd work together to help me process the trauma, so I could be the mother Oliver needed without carrying the weight of what my mother did to me. Oliver had his weekly therapy session with Chelsea the next afternoon. I dropped him off at her office, which had toys scattered across the floor and drawings taped to every wall. Chelsea always let me sit in the waiting room while she worked with Oliver alone in a space where he felt safe to talk. This session lasted almost an hour. When Chelsea opened the door, Oliver ran out holding a piece of paper folded in half. He showed me the drawing he made of himself holding a big shield with a scary dark figure on the other side. The figure had angry eyes and reaching hands, but the shield kept it away from the boy in the picture. Chelsea told me later that this was a major breakthrough in Oliver's therapy. He was beginning to understand that his grandmother's abuse wasn't his fault, and that he had protection now. She said the shield represented safety, and the scary figure represented his fear of my mother. Drawing it helped him process what happened and put some distance between himself and the trauma. I hung the picture on our refrigerator when we got home, and Oliver stood looking at it for a long time before asking if the shield would always keep him safe. I promised him it would. 2 days later, Alexis called to tell me my mother's lawyer wanted to negotiate a plea deal. Her voice sounded tired through the phone, like she'd been handling difficult cases all week. She explained that my mother's lawyer was offering to have her plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for avoiding jail time. My mother would admit to some form of wrongdoing, but the charges would be reduced, and she'd get probation instead of prison. The prosecutor wanted my opinion before deciding whether to accept the offer. I sat on my couch staring at the wall, trying to figure out what I wanted. Part of me thought a plea deal would end this faster and save Oliver from having to testify in court. But another part of me knew my mother needed real consequences for what she did. I told Alexis I wanted whatever would keep Oliver safest in the long run. If that meant a trial where everything came out in public, then I was ready for that. If it meant a plea deal that guaranteed my mother stayed away from us, then I could accept that too. Alexis said she'd pass my response to the prosecutor and they'd make the final decision. Detective Melton called again a week later with information I didn't want to hear. He said my mother had been calling relatives from my extended family, telling them I was keeping Oliver from her out of spite. She was painting herself as a victim of a vindictive daughter who wanted to hurt her. 3 of my relatives called me within 2 days to lecture me about forgiveness and family. My Aunt Rachel said I was being cruel to an old woman who only wanted to see her grandson. My Uncle Tom said families should work things out privately, instead of involving the legal system. My cousin Jennifer said I was probably overreacting, and that grandmothers from that generation just had different ideas about discipline. I listened to each of them tell me I was wrong before I explained what actually happened. I told them about the 17 bruises and the recording of my mother hitting Oliver and threatening him. I told them about her showing up at my door with police officers trying to get me arrested for the abuse she caused. The silence on the phone after I explained was heavy and uncomfortable. Rachel apologized immediately and said she had no idea it was that serious. Tom got quiet and then admitted he remembered my mother being harsh when we were kids. Jennifer said she felt terrible for not listening to my side first. 2 of my aunts called the next day to apologize more thoroughly. Aunt Shane cried on the phone saying she was sorry for not supporting me right away. She said she should have known something was really wrong for me to take such serious action. Aunt Linda was quieter, but just as sincere. She told me something I'd never heard before about my mother being physically abusive to her own siblings when they were growing up. Linda said my mother was the oldest of 5 kids, and she used to hit her younger brothers and sisters when their parents weren't watching. Everyone just accepted it as normal back then, because that's how families worked in the 1960s. Nobody talked about abuse or got help. They just survived and moved on and pretended everything was fine. Linda said she'd spent years in therapy dealing with what my mother did to her as a child. Hearing this made me realize the cycle of abuse went back even further than I knew. My mother learned to hurt people because nobody ever stopped her or taught her better. But I was stopping it now before it damaged Oliver the way it damaged me and Linda, and probably others in the family who never spoke up. The prosecutor called Alexis a few days later to say they decided not to offer a plea deal after all. My mother had given an interview to a local news station claiming she was the victim of a vindictive daughter who wanted revenge for childhood discipline. She sat in her living room looking frail and sad while telling the reporter that modern parents were too soft and didn't understand traditional values. She said I was punishing her for raising me with structure and consequences. The interview was supposed to make people sympathize with her, but it backfired completely. She came across as entitled and cold with no remorse for hurting Oliver. She never once said she was sorry or admitted she might have gone too far. The prosecutor watched the interview and decided my mother wasn't someone who deserved leniency. Alexis said this actually helped our case because it showed my mother's true character to anyone who might serve on the jury. Oliver asked me a question one night while I was tucking him into bed that I didn't know how to answer. He looked up at me with his serious brown eyes and asked why Grandma was so mean to him when he tried to be good. I sat on the edge of his bed feeling my throat get tight. I wanted to give him an answer that made sense, but the truth was complicated and painful. I told him some people hurt others because they're hurting inside themselves. I said it had nothing to do with him being good or bad. He was a wonderful kid who deserved kindness and love. Grandma had problems in her own heart that made her act in mean ways. But none of that was his fault, and he should never think he caused it by being difficult or asking for things. He was just a normal kid who wanted juice and attention and to feel safe. I said the most important thing for him to know was that what happened to him was wrong, and it would never happen again, because I would always protect him now. Madison called me the following Thursday evening after watching Oliver all day. Her voice sounded happy and light through the phone. She told me Oliver had mentioned something during their time together that she thought I should know. He said he used to be scared all the time, but now he only got scared sometimes. Madison said this seemed like real progress to her. She also mentioned he'd been laughing more during their Thursdays together and seemed like a normal, happy kid most of the time. They'd played games in the backyard that afternoon, and he'd run around making silly noises and pretending to be a dinosaur. She said seeing him act like a regular 7-year-old made her realize how much he'd been holding back before. I thanked her for telling me and felt relief wash through my chest. Oliver was healing slowly, but steadily in an environment where he felt safe. Chelsea called me 2 days later to give me an update on Oliver's progress in therapy. She said his trauma symptoms were improving significantly with the consistent therapy sessions and the stable, safe environment at home. He was sleeping better through the night without as many nightmares. He was more willing to talk about his feelings instead of shutting down when something bothered him. He was showing appropriate emotional responses to situations instead of the flat affect he'd had when therapy started. Chelsea said she was really pleased with how far he'd come in just a few months. She recommended we continue the weekly therapy sessions for at least 6 more months to make sure the progress stuck, and to help him process everything that would happen during the trial. I agreed immediately because I wanted Oliver to have every possible support as we moved forward. The criminal trial started on a cold December morning. I walked into the courthouse with Alexis beside me, her hand on my shoulder as we passed through the metal detectors. The building smelled like old wood and floor cleaner. My mother sat at the defense table in a navy blue dress that made her look like somebody's sweet grandmother. She didn't look at me when I entered. The prosecutor called me to the stand first. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. My voice shook when I started talking about the first bruises I found on Oliver's arms. I described photographing all 17 marks on his body that Thursday night, how some were yellow and fading while others were fresh purple. The prosecutor asked me to explain how I made the recording. I told the jury about installing the app on Oliver's tablet and sending him to my mother's house one more time. My hands trembled when they played clips of the recording in court. Hearing my mother's voice again made my stomach turn. The prosecutor asked about my own childhood. I hadn't planned to talk about it, but the words came out anyway. I described the wooden spoon she kept in the kitchen drawer, how she'd hit me across the face for spilling milk, how I learned to stay quiet and small and invisible, how I convinced myself for 30 years that it was normal discipline, that I deserved it, that every mother raised children that way. The defense lawyer asked if I had any proof of my childhood abuse. I said no, just memories I'd buried until I saw the same thing happening to my son. He suggested I might be projecting my feelings onto a normal grandparent relationship. I looked directly at the jury and said the bruises on Oliver's body weren't my feelings. They were evidence. Oliver testified the next day through closed-circuit TV from a room down the hall. I watched him on the screen in the courtroom, sitting in a chair that made him look even smaller than he was. The prosecutor asked gentle questions about his Thursdays at Grandma's house. Oliver's voice came through the speakers, quiet but clear. He described being hit with her hand and with a wooden spoon. He said she told him I would lose my job if he told anyone, that we'd have to live in a box under a bridge, that it would be his fault for being bad. He started crying when he talked about asking for a second juice box and getting slapped. The prosecutor asked if anyone ever told him to lie about what happened. Oliver shook his head and said Grandma told him to say he didn't remember if anyone asked about bruises. I watched my mother's face on the other side of the courtroom. She stared at the screen with no expression at all. When Oliver finished testifying, I wanted to run to him, but Alexis told me to wait until the court took a break. I found him in the small room with the victim advocate. He threw his arms around my waist and asked if he did okay. I knelt down and told him he was so brave, that I was proud of him, that it was almost over. Dr. Reyes took the stand after lunch. She brought enlarged photos of Oliver's bruises that she projected on a screen for the jury. She pointed out the patterns with a laser pointer, explaining how grab marks show 4 fingers on one side and a thumb on the other. She described impact bruises from flat objects versus round objects. She talked about the force required to create deep tissue bruising in a 6-year-old child. The defense lawyer asked if children could get similar bruises from playground accidents. Dr. Reyes said no, not in these patterns, not in these locations, not with this frequency. She'd been a pediatrician for 15 years and had seen thousands of childhood injuries. These bruises were absolutely consistent with intentional abuse. The defense lawyer tried to suggest that some children bruise more easily than others. Dr. Reyes agreed that was true, but said it didn't explain the pattern, the locations, or the different stages of healing. She said Oliver's bruises told a clear story of repeated intentional harm over a period of months. When she stepped down, I saw 2 jury members looking at my mother with disgust on their faces. My mother took the stand the next morning. Her lawyer had her describe her relationship with Oliver, how she'd watched him every Thursday for 2 years. She talked about how much she loved her grandson, how she only wanted what was best for him. She said she believed in old-fashioned discipline, the kind that built character and taught children respect. Her lawyer asked about the recording. She admitted she'd disciplined Oliver but said it was never abuse, just correction. She said children today were spoiled and needed firm guidance. She looked at the jury and said she raised her own daughter the same way, and I turned out fine. The prosecutor stood up for cross-examination. He asked her to define the difference between discipline and abuse. She said discipline was done out of love. He asked if threatening a 6-year-old with homelessness was love. She said she was teaching him about consequences. He asked if hitting a child hard enough to leave bruises for days was love. She said sometimes children needed to understand that actions have results. He played the recording of her hitting Oliver for asking for juice. Her voice filled the courtroom, cold and angry, telling him greedy children get corrected. The sound of the slap. Oliver crying, her voice getting harder, telling him to stop crying or she'd give him something to cry about. Several jury members looked away from her. One woman in the front row had tears running down her face. When the recording ended, the prosecutor asked my mother if that was love. She pressed her lips together and didn't answer. The prosecution played the full recording the next day. The courtroom went completely silent except for my mother's voice coming through the speakers. Every incident was there. Hitting Oliver for laughing during her show. Hitting him for asking to call me. Hitting him for stepping on her foot by accident. Each time she reminded him that telling would destroy me, that we'd lose everything, that he'd be responsible for making us homeless. The recording lasted 40 minutes. I watched the jury members' faces change as they listened. Shock, anger, disgust. One man shook his head slowly back and forth. When it ended, nobody moved for several seconds. The prosecutor let the silence sit. Then he asked the jury to remember that voice the next time they looked at the woman sitting at the defense table in her nice dress, trying to look like a loving grandmother. My mother stared straight ahead with her hands folded on the table. She showed nothing on her face. The defense lawyer stood up and objected to the recording being used as evidence. He argued it was taken without my mother's knowledge or consent in her own home. He said it violated her privacy rights and shouldn't be allowed in court. The judge asked the prosecutor to respond. He said parents have the legal right to record their minor children's environments for safety purposes. He said the recording was made to protect Oliver from suspected abuse, which is exactly what the law allows. The judge took 10 minutes to review the legal precedent. Then he ruled that the recording was admissible. He said parental rights to protect children outweigh privacy expectations when abuse is suspected. The defense lawyer tried to argue further, but the judge cut him off. The recording would stay. I saw my mother's lawyer lean over and whisper something to her. She shook her head sharply. Closing arguments happened the following afternoon. The prosecutor stood in front of the jury and summarized the evidence. The photos showing 17 bruises in various stages of healing. Dr. Reyes's expert testimony that the patterns were consistent with intentional abuse. Oliver's testimony about being hit and threatened. The recording of my mother's own voice admitting to the abuse while it was happening. He said this wasn't a case about different parenting styles or generational differences. This was systematic abuse of a 6-year-old child by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Someone who hit hard enough to leave bruises for days. Someone who threatened a child with homelessness to keep him silent. Someone who then tried to blame the child's own mother when she got caught. He asked the jury to listen to that recording one more time in their minds and think about what kind of person does that to a 6-year-old who just wanted juice. The defense lawyer's closing argument was weak. He tried to paint my mother as a traditional grandmother from a different generation who believed in firm discipline. He suggested the case was a family dispute blown out of proportion by an overly sensitive daughter. He said children were tougher than we gave them credit for, that a little discipline never hurt anyone. 3 jury members crossed their arms when he said that. He finished quickly and sat down. I could tell he knew he'd lost. The jury left to deliberate at 2 p.m. Alexis told me it could take hours or even days. We went to a coffee shop across the street to wait. I couldn't drink anything. My stomach felt like it was tied in knots. Madison texted me to ask how it was going. Carly sent a message saying everyone at work was thinking of me. Chelsea called to check in and remind me that whatever happened, Oliver was safe now. We got the call at 4:30. The jury had reached a verdict. We rushed back to the courthouse. My hands shook so hard I could barely open the door. The jury filed in with serious faces. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The foreman stood up and said yes. Guilty on all charges. Child abuse. Filing a false police report. Guilty. Guilty. I heard the words but couldn't quite believe them. My mother sat perfectly still at the defense table. Her face showed nothing. No surprise, no anger, no remorse, just blank. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. As the bailiff led my mother out, she turned and looked directly at me. Her expression said this wasn't over. I looked back and didn't flinch. Sentencing day arrived on a gray morning 2 weeks before Christmas. The courtroom was less crowded this time. Just the lawyers, court staff, and me sitting in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. My mother wore the same navy dress. The judge reviewed the case details and the jury's verdict. He asked if my mother wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Her lawyer advised her not to, but she stood anyway. She said she'd spent her whole life taking care of her family, that she'd raised her daughter and helped raise her grandson, that she'd never asked for anything in return, that this whole situation was a misunderstanding caused by a daughter who couldn't handle the stress of single parenthood. She said she forgave me for what I'd done to her. The judge's expression didn't change. He said he'd reviewed all the evidence carefully, that the recording alone was enough to prove systematic abuse. Threatening a child with homelessness to maintain silence showed clear consciousness of wrongdoing. That filing a false police report to blame the victim's mother was particularly disturbing. He sentenced her to 18 months in jail, followed by 3 years of probation. She'd have to complete anger management classes and parenting classes. He issued a permanent restraining order protecting Oliver and me. My mother would never be allowed to contact either of us again for any reason. She finally showed emotion then. Her face went red and she started to speak, but her lawyer grabbed her arm. The bailiff led her away. I watched her go and felt something release in my chest. Alexis walked me out of the courthouse into the cold December air. She told me my mother's lawyer would probably file an appeal, but that with evidence this strong, the conviction would almost certainly stand. She explained that my mother would likely serve at least 12 months before any possibility of early release. Maybe more if she didn't behave well in jail. I asked what would happen if the appeal succeeded. Alexis said it wouldn't, that I needed to trust the system had worked correctly this time. We stood on the courthouse steps, and she gave me her card with her personal cell number written on the back. She said to call if my mother tried to contact me in any way, even through other people. I promised I would. Then I drove to Madison's house to pick up Oliver. He was building with blocks in her living room. When he saw me, he ran over and asked what happened to Grandma. I knelt down and told him she had to go to a place where people learn not to hurt others. He thought for a moment, then said he hoped she learned to be nice. I hugged him tight and thought about how he could still hope for her to change when I'd given up on that possibility 30 years ago. His words settled in my chest like something warm. I held him close and thought about the woman I'd been just months ago, the one who ignored bruises and convinced herself everything was fine. That version of me wouldn't recognize the person sitting here now, the one who'd fought back and won. Oliver wiggled free and returned to his blocks, humming a song from the school. I watched him build a tower, knock it down, start again without frustration. The simple joy of a kid being a kid. December crept up faster than I expected. The apartment felt colder than usual, and I kept the heat low to save money. Legal fees had drained my savings account to almost nothing. Therapy costs added up every week. I sat at my kitchen table one night after Oliver went to bed, staring at bills spread across the surface like accusation letters. Rent was due in 8 days. I had enough to cover it, but nothing left for groceries or gas. My credit card was maxed out from the lawyer's retainer. I put my head in my hands and tried not to panic. The next morning at work, Carly called me into her office. She closed the door and handed me an envelope. Inside was a stack of cash and a card signed by everyone in our department. She explained that she'd told people I was dealing with a family emergency and legal costs, and they'd all wanted to help. The collection totaled $1,400, enough for 2 months of rent. I started crying right there in her office, ugly tears that made my nose run. Carly handed me tissues and told me I'd earned this kindness by being a good coworker and a brave mother. She said everyone admired what I'd done to protect Oliver. I tried to thank her but couldn't get words out past the lump in my throat. She hugged me and said to pay it forward someday when I was back on my feet. Thursday afternoons became something different after that. Madison started coming over at 3 when Oliver got home from the school. The first week, they made chocolate chip cookies from scratch. Oliver came running to show me when I got home, his face smeared with chocolate and his smile huge. The second week, Madison took him to the park and pushed him on the swings until he laughed so hard he got hiccups. The third week, they played board games at our kitchen table, and Oliver won at Candyland 3 times in a row. One Thursday in late December, Oliver told me something that made my heart squeeze. He said Thursdays used to be his worst day because he knew he had to go to Grandma's house. Now they were his favorite day because Madison always had fun stuff planned and he never felt scared. I hugged him and told him every day should feel safe and happy from now on. He nodded against my shoulder and asked if we could have pizza for dinner. Chelsea scheduled a joint session with Oliver and me in mid-December. She had Oliver draw pictures while we talked, keeping him busy but present. She told me he'd made remarkable progress over the past few months. His nightmares had decreased to maybe once a week instead of nightly. He was showing healthy attachment behaviors, asking for comfort when upset instead of hiding his feelings. His emotional expression had become age-appropriate, crying when hurt but recovering quickly. She said his play patterns in therapy showed a kid processing trauma in healthy ways. She recommended reducing our sessions from weekly to every other week. Oliver could continue improving with less frequent check-ins now that he felt secure. I asked if the progress would last or if he might backslide. Chelsea said trauma could resurface during stress or transitions, but Oliver had strong coping skills now and a stable support system. She expected him to keep healing as long as his environment stayed consistent and safe. My own therapy sessions became harder as Christmas approached. I'd been seeing someone since right after the trial, working through my own childhood memories that kept surfacing. One session, I broke down completely, sobbing about how I should have seen what was happening sooner. How I'd handed Oliver to my mother every Thursday for 2 years while she hurt him. How I was supposed to protect him and I'd failed. My therapist let me cry it out, then spoke carefully. She reminded me that I took action the moment I saw clear evidence. That recognizing abuse when you've been conditioned to accept it as normal takes tremendous strength. That I'd broken a generational cycle of violence by refusing to minimize what happened. She said my mother had spent 30 years teaching me not to trust my instincts, and I'd overcome that programming to save my son. The guilt would fade with time as I kept proving to myself that I was a good mother. I left that session feeling lighter, but exhausted. 3 months after the trial, Oliver turned 7. I planned a birthday party at our apartment with his school friends, Madison, Carly, and her family, and my 2 supportive aunts. I bought decorations from the dollar store and baked a cake from a box mix. Oliver wanted a superhero theme, so everything was covered in capes and masks. 8 kids showed up, running around our small living room and playing games Madison organized. Carly brought pizza and her husband handled the music. My aunts arrived with presents they'd wrapped carefully. Oliver opened gifts surrounded by people who loved him, his face glowing with excitement over action figures and books. When it was time for cake, everyone sang happy birthday. I lit 7 candles and told Oliver to make a wish. He squeezed his eyes shut, thought hard, then blew them all out in one breath. Later, Madison told me what he'd wished for. He said he wanted every day to be this happy. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to cry for a minute. When I came back out, Oliver was showing his friends how to pose like superheroes, and the apartment was full of laughter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in January, plain white envelope with the county jail's return address. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside, my mother's handwriting covered 3 pages. She wrote about how jail had given her time to think, how she realized she'd made mistakes and how she disciplined Oliver, how she'd been raised the same way and didn't know any better. She said she'd been attending anger management classes and talking to a counselor. She claimed she understood now that hitting was wrong. She asked for forgiveness and said she'd changed. She wanted a chance to rebuild our relationship when she got out. I read it twice, looking for genuine remorse. All I found was justification and excuses. I called Alexis and read her the letter over the phone. Alexis said not to respond, that my mother was likely trying to build a case for early release or appeal. She reminded me that the restraining order was permanent and my mother couldn't contact me legally anyway. I thanked her and hung up. Then I tore the letter into small pieces and threw it away. I didn't need her apology to move forward. Oliver and I were doing fine without her. Winter turned our routine peaceful. Oliver went to the school every morning without the stomach aches he used to get on Thursdays. He slept through most nights in his own bed, only occasionally climbing in with me after bad dreams. His teacher sent home notes about how well he was doing, how he participated in class and played nicely with other kids. Madison watched him twice a week now instead of just Thursdays, because I'd picked up some overtime shifts. He adored her and talked constantly about the games they played. My aunts visited every few weeks, bringing groceries and spending time with Oliver. He was showing the personality that had been buried under fear for so long. Silly jokes and endless questions about how things worked. Excitement over small things like finding a cool rock or seeing a dog at the park. The joyful, curious kid he was supposed to be all along. My supervisor called me into her office in late February. I walked in expecting bad news, maybe about my performance during all the time I'd taken off for court. Instead, she offered me a promotion. The position came with a significant raise and better hours. I'd be managing a small team instead of doing data entry. She said I'd earned it through years of reliable work and my ability to handle pressure with grace. The raise was enough to afford quality after-school care for Oliver and continue his therapy without financial stress. I accepted immediately, thanking her multiple times. When I told Carly later, she hugged me and made a joke. She said standing up to my mother had taught me to advocate for myself everywhere, including at work. I laughed because she was right. Something had shifted in me during those months of fighting. I'd learned my voice mattered and my boundaries deserved respect. On Thursday afternoon, I drove to Madison's house to pick up Oliver and found him waiting on the front porch with a piece of paper clutched in both hands. He saw my car and jumped up, running down the walkway so fast Madison had to call after him to be careful. I barely got out of the driver's seat before he crashed into my legs, waving the paper in my face with his whole body vibrating with excitement. It was a drawing he'd made in therapy that morning. Chelsea had sent him home with it because she said he'd worked so hard on it and wanted to show me right away. The picture showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, one tall and one small, both with big circle smiles. Above the rainbow he'd written in his careful 7-year-old handwriting, letters wobbling but clear, the words, safe, and happy. I knelt down on the sidewalk and looked at it closely, tracing my finger over the crayon marks, feeling something tight in my chest loosen and release. Oliver pressed against my side, his head tucked under my chin, and asked if I liked it. I told him it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and I was going to put it on the refrigerator where I could look at it every single day. That night after dinner and bath time, I tucked Oliver into bed, pulling his blanket up to his chin the way he liked. He looked up at me with those serious brown eyes and said he loved me, and that I was the best mom in the world. I kissed his forehead, breathing in the clean smell of his shampoo, and realized with sudden clarity that protecting him was the most important thing I'd ever done in my entire life. Our future stretched ahead of us, bright and open, because we were finally free from the cycle of abuse that had defined my childhood, and almost claimed him too. I turned off his lamp and left his door cracked open with the hallway light on, and I could hear him humming softly to himself as he drifted off to sleep. All right, that's all I've got today. Thanks for letting me share this little moment with you. I hope it sits with you in a good way.